Hey, Hans McCarthy here with Dave Oswald with the Unsilenced podcast. I'd just like to give a shout out to my sponsor, Chim's Cabin. Chim's Cabins in Port Alberni, BC offers 6 private cabins sleeping 1 to 5 guests in 1 to 3 beds, all featuring full-size kitchen and dedicated guest laundry. Stay here, travel there. Your last stop for the West Coast, just a short drive to Tofino. Book directly at chims.ca, chims.ca for the best rates. And I'll let you introduce yourself, Dave.
Hi, I'm Dave Oswald. I'm a chartered accountant who's been in the forensics auditing field for the last 30 odd years. So, yes, we've basically been there, seen it, and done it.
Okay. So yeah, today we're going to be talking about the FSIN. I believe it's $34 million that happened on a forensic audit, and a lot of people are concerned about FSIN because they're concerned that it represents 74 First Nations across Saskatchewan, and they don't really want to see a mismanagement of the funds that they have and that have went to the First Nation communities. And also for the FSIN, if anyone doesn't know, there's all 74 chiefs are represented at the FSIN as well too, and they do have a say when it comes to voting on matters. Only 12 chiefs voted for accountability, and the rest of the chiefs voted to not have accountability. You can read up on that on any article. So I have a first question for you, Dave. For those who haven't followed this closely, what did the FSIN audit actually mean?
Okay, so let's unpack it a little bit. The first thing is that it wasn't an audit of the complete band. That's the first mistake that people make. They hear these figures and they think, oh, it was a complete forensics audit. No, it wasn't. This was purely in respect of government funding into various projects and the expenditure that was from that government funding. So it excluded any self-income, any trust funds, any other funding that was received by the band, which wasn't linked to a program. Now, it's quite scary what the audit found. And the audit found basically that $4.8 million of ineligible spending took place. Now, that doesn't mean fraudulent spending, it's ineligible spending. And what does that mean? Well, that means that it was spent on stuff that was never allowed in terms of the program. So, for instance, a lot of the programs say that you can't buy a truck. And we went out and we bought a truck. Or you can't buy a TV, and we went out and bought TVs. So that's the ineligible part of it. The TVs are probably a bit more dodgy than the truck, but and then there was $23.9 million of unsupported claims, mainly around COVID funding. And this is probably a wake-up call for all of the bands in Canada. Now, unsupported doesn't mean that it wasn't allowed. It means that there's no documentation showing that the flow through of funds took place correctly and within the rules. So there's no documentation for $23.9 million. Now, that's basically a control failure, a document collapse, and there's some clear misuse of funds that are laid in there. So poor administration and what looks like on the surface to be a lot of fraud.
Okay. The mention of significant amounts being unsupported, how serious is this in real terms?
Well, it's very serious because that 23.2 million that the government is claiming back has to be paid back by the First Nations. That's a lot of money for any First Nation to have to pay back. So what actually happened? Well, there's no linkage between PPE purchases. There's no linkage between delivery, and there's no linkage between who the final recipients of it were. And the ISC actually requires proof of delivery. They want packing slips, they want bills of lading, they want all of these sorts of normal things that you get when you're buying product. So FSIN had evidence of invoices, but no evidence that the goods ever reached the community that they were meant to reach. And that
Okay.
is scary that you don't have that. So no flow through funding, no audit trail. And while the pandemic urgency is acknowledged, if you can't prove where you spent the money, you got to pay it back.
Okay. Now, auditors use the phrase insufficient documentation. In your world, what does that actually translate to?
Well, let's say that I give you $50,000, sorry, to go buy a truck. And you go and buy the truck, and I come to you and I say, Hans, where is the bill of sale for this truck? And you say, Dave, I didn't get one. So I said to you, okay, I know there's a truck outside, but I don't know how much you bought it for. I don't know whether it's somebody else's that you've just borrowed for a short period of time to show me a truck. So if you can't show me an invoice that you've actually bought that truck, I want my money back. And that's, dumbing it down. That's what the lack of documentation is. In this case, we've got an invoice which says we bought 300,000 masks, but we don't have anything showing that those masks were ever received, that they were distributed to people. There's no accountability for how many masks are left at the end of the day. None of that. And so the government's saying, well, did you actually buy those masks? Or did you not?
Where do you think the breakdown happened? Systems, oversight, or people?
All of the above.
All the above. Okay.
So it's a serious breakdown in administration. It's very poor procurement controls. So when you go into procurement, you're meant to, let's go back to our truck. When you spend 50,000, I'm meant to say, have a BCR or at least have documentation saying that we've given Hans 50,000 to go buy a truck. And when you buy the truck and you come back with the invoice, we've got a copy of the invoice, we've got a copy of the registration, and we've got a copy of everything to show that you're actually driving the truck. That's what's required. Taking it down into the pandemic again, if you buy 300,000 masks, how do I know that 300,000 masks were delivered to the band? Do I have documentation showing that it was delivered? How were they booked? Where were they booked into a store? I mean, 300,000 is quite a few, and it should have been booked in somewhere. And then when they were given out to the community, how were they given out? So did we just hand them out without anything, or did we get people to sign that, Mr. McCarthy has taken 100 masks? And if you
Okay.
don't have that, well, what's to say that you bought 20,000 masks, you got somebody to invoice you for 300,000, and the difference you put in your back pocket, which is why it's so serious and why why the government is actually asking for the money back. They're saying the invoice is there, but they're saying they can't prove what happened to those goods.
Okay. My next question is a two-part question. First part is um, what at what point does this move from poor administration into something more concerning? And then based on what you've seen, is there enough here to justify a full forensic investigation? Because I know you talked about that it wasn't basically a full forensic investigation.
Well, I mean, we're only looking at one very small part of the band. And there's these problems in that one very small part of the band. So if you take, it's unlikely that the problems are only going to be in the way the government money was spent. If you're spending irrationally with government money, you're also going to be spending irrationally with sole source money. And so, yes, it does make sense that there's a forensics audit. It also makes sense that a lot of work is done to, start creating a document trail for what actually happened to the 23.2 million. I mean, that's a substantial amount of money, which we could potentially get back from the government if we're able to prove that this is where the goods were delivered, to give them adequate proof that we did receive the product and we did actually send it out or use it within the community in terms of a flow through.
Okay, what is the real world consequences of something like this for this FSIN organization and its stakeholders, which are the 74 First Nations in Saskatchewan?
Well, it means that each of the 74 First Nations are on the hook for about $500,000 if you just take it across the board. That's a problem, and that means that each of members probably on the hook for, I don't know, $10,000, $5,000, somewhere around there. And that's serious money. I mean, we're not talking just a little bit of money. We're talking a lot of money.
Yeah. Yes. Well, if you and say Friends of Restitutions were brought in tomorrow, what would your first steps be?
Well, the first step would be to get hold of all of the documentation for the purchase of all of this 23.2 million and to actually go through it, find out what happened, would be to go to those suppliers where we purchase the stuff, get bills of lading, get documentation for it coming in, and then try and work and then see if we can work backwards from what's at our suppliers to get some figures for where it ended up. And then the next stage would be to start, building a case that, yes, going around the communities and saying how many mosques or how many of this, how many, packets of COVID testing kits did you guys actually get? And getting affidavits signed that, yes, we received 10 COVID testing kits per person type thing. And that's really, so you're recreating that chain of evidence in order that, you're never going to get the 23.2 million back. But hopefully you can reduce it to, let's say, 2.3 million. And if you can do that, you've won a huge battle.
Okay. Well, let's be blunt. If this isn't followed up properly, what do you think will happen next?
Well, next, the government will reclaim 23.2 million. So either they won't supply funding in terms of agreements that they have in order to fund until that money is paid back. And that's serious for the First Nations. That is going to put a lot of people in a lot of hardship.
Okay. One last question before we end it here. I have a lot of people that are asking how to get a hold of you. I know on a previous video you put down there. I was wondering if you would be comfortable with allowing people or telling them how they could get a hold of you and Friends of Restitutions.
Yeah, sure. But before we get there, Hans, I think we just need to cover the other side of this. And this is
Sure.
the 5.8 million that was ineligible expenditure.
Okay.
I mean, we've covered the 23.2 million quite carefully, but the 5.8 million is a completely different kettle of fish. Now, what happened with the 5.8 million isn't that the money was stolen, not necessarily anyway. It's that money was spent on projects that it wasn't allowed to be spent on. So, for instance, we did an office building construction and we took it out of one of the programs where it specifically said that we were not allowed to do capital project expenditure. So now, what does the ban do? Well, one of the things that came up in the audit is that there was commingling of funds. So what we really need to do now is to split out all of these funds that were used incorrectly and put them to banned funds or non-government funding, non-program funding, and then have a look to see how much money is left in the funding projects and use that specifically for funding what is allowed in terms of the funding. So again, it doesn't mean that it's a complete write-off, but it does mean that you've got to do some work in getting and making sure that everything goes into the right bucket.
Okay.
The other thing is that within that expenditure, there was some stuff that like TVs and cars that were bought and stuff like that, and overcharging of rent. There's a whole lot that was bought on programs, which is obviously not allowed in terms of the programs. Now, where did these TVs that were bought end up? Did they end up in council offices? If yes, not it's a problem that they were bought on a program where they weren't allowed to be bought. Very definitely it's a problem, but it's not theft. If, however, they ended up in one of the councillors' houses or somebody's house, then we've got a totally different matter on board. And then we've got theft. So, that's what we really need to do. We've got one person who resigned, got severance, and then a week later he was rehired, and he was also paid by a consulting company that he owned. So he was getting a salary and being paid by a consulting company. How can, I'm sorry, but that's really shady. I'm not going to call it fraud, but because we haven't looked at the actual details, but just reading the report, that is very, very shady. So, and putting in duplicate invoices. I mean, 101 on expense claims is we'll look out for duplicate invoices because that's where fraud takes place. And that's what they found within this audit, $155,000 worth of. So, when you start looking at that, you start saying, well, yeah, there is a problem. And people need, and this is indications that a forensics investigation and making people accountable for the way that they spent money is absolutely critical. You cannot have these types of, the band cannot afford to lose this type of money.
Any last things, any last comments?
Yeah, okay, so the last comment, yes, people can get hold of me. Dave at forensicrestitution.com. Hans will put it in we'll add it below or above when this is posted. So Dave at forensicrestitution.com. If the matter is urgent, 416-525-1510 is my phone number. Please remember that I am sitting in Ontario, not in BC, so don't try and phone me at like 8 o'clock BC time.
Okay, thank you very much, Dave. We really appreciate your time and your hard work that you put into this and the past two episodes for coming on Unsilenced podcast. Really appreciate it. You have yourself a good day and good evening and take care.
Keep well, Hans, and keep up the good work.
Okay, bye.